this report is subtitled Certainty and Uncertainty. We're certain that the sea is rising and will continue to do so for centuries, and that's because there's a lot of inertia in the climate system, and as the atmosphere heats up, it takes a lot of time for that heat to be transferred through into the ocean. But we are uncertain about how fast it would happen, and we're uncertain about what we should do about it. So we've got to keep both those things in mind. We're certain it's happening, but we're uncertain how fast and what to do. The main conclusions of this report are that councils and communities need more help, more and better help from central government, that the current direction and advice that's being given is simply not up to it, but we do have some time to plan. It is more important to prepare well than to rush. It's difficult. This is terra incognita. We need to think hard and get it right. 3 kinds of impacts from a rising sea. The first one's flooding, coastal flooding. Second one is erosion, more erosion. And the third one is problems with groundwater. And I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. Flooding, an increase in the frequency, extent, and duration of coastal flooding. It is all about the high tide. We don't really care what happens to the low tide in this. It's all about how high the high tide gets in the future. There is a lot of natural variation in the height of the sea. In fact, we might even see the sea go down a bit at times. Part of this is what are known as astronomical tides, when the sun and the moon are both pulling together on the sea. Storm surges, when the weather turns bad, the barometer drops because the air pressure drops. So in a cyclone out there in the Pacific, as the air pressure drops, it sucks the sea up towards it, and you can get a bulge on the surface of the sea, and the wind can then drive that onto the land. And a storm surge like that will ride on top of the high tide and make the sea considerably higher. So you need to think about that as well. And of course, you can get waves on the top of that. And adding to all of that are long-term weather patterns. Things happen to the level of the sea in El Nino times, and there are other cycles of weather as well. But for a starting point in thinking about flooding, we need to look at low-lying areas along the coast. But I would emphasise that that's not the whole story. There are many other factors that matter: the shape of the coast, the kind of defences are there, whether they're built seawalls, rock armouring, big rocks piled up, or whether they're sand dunes. So predictions need to be, in a sense, very local. You need to localise them to the point to think about what will happen where. And here's just some photographs of the kind of thing we might expect more of. These all happen to be around Wellington, actually. That's the south coast. This weather map is the isobar map on the day the Wahine sunk. On that particular day, see how close the isobars are together. On that day, the highest storm surge measured in New Zealand was measured in Tauranga Harbour, 88 centimetres, sitting on top of the high tide. But generally, New Zealand does not experience really high storm surges. They might be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, but some countries overseas will have storm surges that are metres high. It's to do with our latitude and other things. And there's the next one is the road to Eastbourne. That's in 2013, the highest sea level on record in the Wellington port was measured on that day. And of course, that's the only road to Eastbourne. So the second thing I want to look at is erosion. Erosion happens when the shores are soft, as we call them. The waves that drag sand off a beach, as the sea becomes higher, those waves will reach higher up the beach and drag off more sand. So beaches that are already eroding will generally erode faster as the sea rises. But where beaches are accreting, where the shore is going outwards, that is much harder to predict. In the long term, an accreting shore will eventually turn to eroding when there's enough sea level rise, but it's very hard to predict where. This is sort of really beyond our scientific models. Again, local factors are enormously important. When it comes to erosion, one of those factors that is central is what is known as a sediment budget. And this is the gravel and so on, shingle that washes around the shores on longshore currents, comes down the rivers from eroding land inland and carried around the shores. And if there's sort of an excess of sediment, a bit like a bank account, you're more likely to get an accreting shore. If it's in the red, if the sediment budget is in the red, you'll be getting erosion. So this is not just about the level of the sea in any particular case. You need to know what's happening with the sediment, but there are other factors as well. One more important point is that soft cliffs don't accrete. Of course, they can't accrete. They will only go in one direction, they will only erode. So it's not just about beaches, it's about cliffs as well. So if we look again at some photographs, that's Waihi Beach. Erosion often occurs in episodes, in big storms, a whole lot of sand scoured out at once, but it can also be gradual. The next one is that's the Kapiti Coast. There's some homeowners trying to protect their properties from erosion with rather contrasting defences. Then the next one is the road south of Amaru, where there are soft cliffs for some considerable distance, both in the town itself and south, where a road is falling increasingly rapidly into the sea. But I now want to talk about groundwater, which is the one we understand least about, but could end up being extremely significant, certainly in some places. Where you have a high water table that is linked to the sea, you have problems. And obviously you get that with reclaimed land, because reclaimed land is land filling in the sea. And so you can get flooding, boggy ground, a kind of which can make liquefaction worse if there happens to be an earthquake. You can also get salt intrusion into groundwater, where that coastal groundwater is linked to the sea. So bogging and saline. This is South Dunedin as it used to be. That's actually an old painting. It was a marsh that was actually filled in, and South Dunedin is really, if you like, one of the hot spots with sea level rise. The water table is very high, in places only this so far above the ground. We hear that if you are a builder in South Dunedin, you don't dig a post hole until it's low tide, otherwise it just fills with water. Because the groundwater in South Dunedin has what's known as a tidal signal. It goes up and down with the tides. They had very bad flooding there in June this year, heavy rain coinciding with a high tide, and of course heavy rain, storm surge, so therefore the water comes up even higher. And there is, that is what happened in South Dunedin. We're just showing you a bit of road there, because this is not just about houses and buildings, this is about infrastructure as well. Napier Airport, I should just say before I go on, sand dunes at St Kilda are so far presenting, and we will for some time protect South Dunedin directly from the sea, but again it's that underneath coming up problem down there. Napier also has some similar problems because of the land that rose during the earthquake, is obviously connected quite closely to the sea. I'm told there that they drill holes in the tarmac when the rain is heavy to let the water go, because otherwise the tarmac would lift off the ground. So there are groundwater problems, and another one that we hear a lot about is the next one in the Pacific, of course, Tuvalu, Kiribati, places like this, very, very close to sea level. Waves overtopping, salt water draining down through porous rock and making the lens of fresh water that floats below that saline, and it's increasingly hard to grow crops in some of those countries. And it's worth pointing out that the population of Tuvalu is over 100,000 people. So in this report I have made 8 recommendations. The first 7 are around national direction and advice. The first one is actually about the form that takes, and I'm just going to go very quickly through these because I know many of you have had a look at them and you can ask me questions about them later. The second one is about accurate measurement of land elevation using a system called LIDAR. Hasn't been done consistently across the country. The maps we'll show you later have been standardised across the country. So they are accurate as possible at the moment. The third one is how much sea level rise should we plan for? How far ahead should we look? That depends on the circumstances. Very different situation, very different type of subdivision where you're subdividing some farmland to create an entire new greenfields, suburb, you would expect that that would be there, for the indefinite future. But if you're talking about an already developed area and someone wants to divide a quarter-acre section in half, that is an entirely different story. So the question should be how far ahead to look, and actually then before we consider how much sea level rise to plan for. The next one is around separating scientific assessment and decision making. Currently, there are coastal risk assessments being done that they need to be done better in many ways, but in particular, they're often overly precautionary, whereas how precautionary to be is the prerogative of the decision makers, the council, who are going to receive these scientific assessments. And so these scientific assessments need to be a lot more objective, for want of a better word. The next one is around engaging with communities. Now, this business of sea level rise is a whole new thing for the world. It's something that we haven't grappled with before. The kinds of natural hazards we're used to dealing with are things like earthquakes and river floods, volcanic eruptions, things that happen suddenly, pretty well without warning. This is a different kind of thing where we've got a relentless rise of the sea over time, and a lot of people are going to be affected over the long term, a lot of social and economic impacts, and we need to engage with communities slowly in a staged approach to give them time to think about it, react to, and decide together what they do about it. This is not a situation to go at too fast. Right, the next one is around strategies for coastlines. If you build a seawall here, do you have to build a seawall in the next place, and the next place, and the next place? Who pays for it? Around the whole coast of England and Wales, they have shoreline management plans to decide where they let the sea come in, where they defend for a time. We need to be thinking in terms of whole coastlines, not just in ad hoc reactions. The last recommendation is around fiscal risk. It's to the Minister of Finance. At one level, there's economic things around creating precedents and funding defences. You funded this one, why can't we have one too? Or we've got to build this bigger and bigger and bigger. But also, going back to South Dunedin for a moment, one of the places this is going to bite pretty early is retreating from South Dunedin. The engineering options there may work a bit for a while, but they're not really a long or even a middle term option. And there are many houses there in a fairly impoverished community, some of them, who are going to have to move somehow. So we need to be thinking about this. There's going to be people wanting compensation because it's not their fault. The people who live in low-lying coastal areas, it's not their fault that this is happening to them. The place where we need to start, the first stage of engagement with communities, is to put out accurate maps of elevation, which we have done with all the data we could get. Some parts of the country have not collected this data, so we were not able to do it everywhere. This applies, low-lying areas close to the coast are the places you would look first to worry about flooding and groundwater problems. But of course those local factors again matter. If it's erosion, and I wanted to talk to a community about erosion, I'd be looking for sequences of aerial photos of what's happened to the shore over time. So we've plotted 3 elevation zones on these maps. Can I make very, very clear they're not hazard zones, they're just elevation above spring high tides, right? I know they're going to be perceived as hazard zones, but they are places that are the first place to look for vulnerability. But some of those places will be quite well protected, maybe by high sand dunes. Why have we chosen those 3 levels of elevation? Well, if you look at the IPCC projections of sea level rise and you go 50 years ahead from now, 30 centimetres of sea level rise around New Zealand is a conservative estimate. On top of 30 centimetres, you can get storm surges and waves. So I would say that anywhere 50 centimetres and below, in the next 50 years, these issues are going to become pressing, unless, of course, they're well protected. In the long run, the sea is going to rise a lot higher than 150 centimetres, but we don't need to worry about that for 100 years or so, although again we need to look ahead. We've got four maps in the report. Auckland. Someone pointed out to me the other day that Devonport is going to become an island. You see that purple golf course in Devonport, and there's some eroding cliffs along the shoreline there, so I can't tell you how long it's going to be. But Auckland actually gets off fairly lightly because it is generally fairly high above the sea. But there's quite a lot of erosion along its beaches. If we go to Wellington, we see Petone, that area there will be in some difficulty. That problem there is compounded by river flooding, where you have rivers that come out to the sea, and you might be getting heavy rain because there's a storm. And can I say that every 1 degree rise in the atmosphere's temperature is a 7% more water that's retained in the atmosphere, which is going to lead to more intense rainfall. So more river floods seem to be on the cards, and where you have a tidal component to your river flood, then the higher the tide is coming up that river as it's flooding, the worse the flooding will be. So that's unfortunate. But even in the CBD of Wellington, that's built on reclaimed land. And so there will be ultimately groundwater problems in the CBD, I should think. Right, so going to Christchurch, which is a bit sad. A lot of those purple areas have actually already been red zoned, so people aren't living there anymore. But land in parts of Christchurch sank by as much as 1.3 metres in the earthquake. And if we go to Dunedin, you can see South Dunedin sticking out there very clearly. Most of that is actually only 25 centimetres above the high tides, although at the moment, of course, you've got the sand dunes along St Kilda protecting it from the sea directly. But again, that groundwater problem is an issue. We have taken all the other data we had and put it into maps, which are all on our website. And you can go there and download maps of any areas that you like. There are 5 other places, 5 cities and towns which where the problems are going to be a little more pressing than others. Napier is a real standout, and that's partly a problem of the earthquake, old earthquake raising land there. Tauranga, Whakatane, where part of the CBD is actually under 50 centimetres, Nelson and Motueka. So all of those 5 have over 1,000 houses below 150 centimetres. And of course, not just about houses, it's about businesses and roads and infrastructure and all the rest of it. So thank you.